Hey there, nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we are back with another episode of Cheap Shots. This is the series that is dedicated to showing you how to save money on the miniatures wargaming hobby. And on today's episode number 67, we're going to show you guys how to quickly and more importantly cheaply paint up the Champions of Death, which is the Shambling Horrors team for Blood Bowl, for Games Workshop's Blood Bowl. So as you can see here, this is what the end result will look like for your guys' miniatures. As you can see, it's a beautiful tabletop standard, and assuming that you're purchasing everything that we recommend for the very first time with our Cheapskate method, you're talking about a grand total investment of $38.21. Now, when you compare that to what Army Painter and Citadel will actually charge you for their equipment and for their supplies, you're talking about a grand total savings of $177.33. So that being said, let's go ahead and show you guys how to quickly and cheaply paint up some Shambling Undead for your games of Blood Bowl. Alright, so the first thing you want to do with your miniatures, of course, is to prime your miniatures. Now in this case, I use Rust-Oleum Flat White Primer. It cost me $3.99 at my local Walmart, and basically just do the once over real quick with the primer all over my miniatures. Now priming actually does a couple of things. The first thing it does actually gives an uneven surface for your acrylic paints to adhere to, because if you were to paint your miniatures on bare plastic with your guys' paints, it would not adhere very well to the original plastic. It'll slide right off and ruin the finish of your miniatures. So you always want to do your priming because it gives something for the acrylic to stick to. The second thing that the primer actually does as well is also helps you out with your guys' color schemes. So traditionally speaking, if you want to go with a brighter color scheme for your miniatures, you want to go with a white primer. If you're going for more of a darker color scheme, traditionally you want to go with a black primer. And of course, if you're just looking for something right in the middle, you use gray. Now, since we're doing a quick paint method, which means we'll be using an oil wash on this, the oil wash will darken down the value of the colors. So because of that, I decided to do with a white undercoat, so that way I can use my bright, bold colors, so that way when I put my oil wash in, it'll not darken it down too badly. The next thing you're going to do once you get done with that, you're going to divide up your guys' team. Now, as you can see in this photo, I pretty much divide them up into pretty much 4 sections. I have my zombies on one side, my ghouls on another group, I have my little mummies on another group as well, and then my skeletons in another group together. And I did that so that way it makes it a little bit easier for to paint these guys. So the first thing I did, of course, is I painted, I guess you would call the flesh on the zombies, the ghouls, the wrappings on the mummies, as well as the bones of the skeletons. Now for my zombies, I put 2 thin layers of wintergreen by Apple Barrel paint. You get this at your local Walmart, costs about 50 cents for that. It's a nice, wonderful, kind of vibrant neon winter green kind of look. And the reason why I like using it so much is because when you dry brush with lime sherbet, it has kind of like this kind of glowing, ethereal, really cartoony zombie effect going on with undead flesh, and I like using it for this. Blood Bowl is kind of a low-key kind of game. It doesn't take itself too seriously, so the more cartoony you can make your miniatures look, the better, in all actuality. Now the next thing I did, of course, I then picked up the skin of my 2 Ghoul runners. I picked out one in Bright Magenta by Apple Barrel, as well as another one by Concord Grape by Apple Barrel as well, so that way they can add some color variety to the miniatures. At the same time, I also painted my mummies. One of them I painted with Territorial Beige. It cost you 50 cents at your local Walmart, and I used khaki for the other mummy, as well as for all 6 skeletons, for 2 whites as well as my 4 skeletons. Put 2 thin layers of all those paints on all the parts that you want to be painted. So the khaki is a wonderful color for all the skeletons, as well as the lighter wrapped mummy. The Territorial Beige makes a good color difference between the 2 mummies there, as well as the magenta and the purple for the flesh of the ghouls, as well as the wintergreen for my zombies. So now that we're done doing our base coat, the next thing you do now is a dry brush. And now dry brushing is a really cool technique. What you do is you usually take a paintbrush, preferably an older paintbrush. The older paintbrush, the better. You apply some paint to it. What you do is that you then brush the paint onto a paper towel. And you do this until there's barely any paint left over on the paintbrush. And the reason why is because when you take this paintbrush, you then dust the entirety of the miniature with it. And when you do dry brushing, the pigment of the paint actually catches upon the raised surfaces of the miniatures, which helps create the illusion of depth in your miniatures as well. Now the darker base coats will stay within the recesses of the miniature, while the dry brushing will catch upon the raised surfaces, giving you that 3-dimensional look for your miniatures. Now when it comes to dry brushing, it is highly suggested you always do a light dry brush first, and then slowly build up the level of brightness that you want on your miniatures with your dry brushing. The reason why is because it's always easy to add more dry brushing onto your miniatures, but it's very difficult to take off once you do it. So because of that, always dry brush in layers. Now in this case, I decided to use a couple of pastel looking colored paints for my miniatures. I use lime sherbet to do the dry brushing of my zombies. At the same time, I use cameo pink for my magenta colored ghoul. lilac mist for my purple ghoul, and I also use khaki paint for apple barrel for my mummy that I painted with territorial beige, and then I also use antique white apple barrel paint to dry brush my miniatures, my skeletons, as well as my other mummy that I had done in khaki. Now, all 4 to 5 of these colors you can get at your local Walmart. They cost you 50 cents. They're super cheap. At the same time, they do a beautiful job. As you can see here, I've caught wonderful detail work by catching the raised surface of the miniature while those darker colors stay in the recesses. Now, I will warn you, it's going to look kind of chalky as well as very pastel when you actually do this dry brushing for your miniatures. Don't worry though, that texturing will go away as well as that pastel kind of hue. It'll bleed in together when I go to our oil washing stage, so don't panic, you're perfectly fine. So now that we're done with all the flesh and bone, I guess, we move on directly towards the clothing. Now, the first set of miniatures I'm going to be actually using are my zombies on my team. So as you can see in this instance, I pretty much worked on all the clothing for all the miniatures as well, and alternated the paint scheme for them as well. Now, when it came to their leather goods, things like their belts, for example, I picked out 2 thin layers of pavement. As for the trousers, as well as the wrapping on these miniatures, I used territorial beige on the zombie on the left. I used Nita's taupe gray acrylic paint for the other wrappings on the mummy in the center left. I then used moccasin brown by Anita's acrylic for the zombie on the inner right, and I used burnt umber by apple barrel paint for the zombie on the far right hand side as well. I basically put 2 thin coats of all these different brands and towns and stuff directly onto the miniatures that I want to have them painted. Now, your apple barrel paints will run you 50 cents at your local Walmart, while the Anita's acrylic will run you 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. And all you do is do 2 thin coats of this all over the parts that you want to be different. Now, I would recommend that you alternate the color scheme as well as the colors that you use for these miniatures, because they're duplicate sculpts and you want to create the illusion of diversity within your miniatures. So by doing this, it kind of helps trick the eye into thinking there's actually more different sculpts and more unique sculpts within your army as well. So now that we're done with the trousers as well as the boots and the miniatures, the next thing we do now is work on the finer details. Now for these guys, what I decided to do is to pick out the hair color, make it a little bit different. So for 2 of these guys, we picked them out in Ripe Tomato by Apple Barrel Paint. Just do 2 thin layers for the hair on these guys. It's just kind of like a cartoony bright color that contrasts nicely with the green skin. And I also used King's Gold by Apple Barrel for the other 2 zombies as well, and that also cost 50 cents at local Walmart as well. Now the next thing we do, of course, is we also painted the entrails on the zombies on the left as well as the entrails on the zombies on the right hand side as well by picking those out in 2 thin layers of bright magenta. And then for the external bone that was exposed from the rib cages, we used light mocha by Apple Barrel, and we put 2 thin layers of that. Now light mocha also costs you 50 cents at your local Walmart as well. And as you can see, it has like this nice kind of bright colored cartoony plants versus zombies type of look to it, and that's exactly what I'm trying to achieve here with my look for this team, because it is Blood Bowl and Blood Bowl is not as serious as the other Games Workshop games. So the very last thing I did for these miniatures, and once I got all those details taken care of, I just did a really light dry brush of pale gray by Folkart. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby for about 75 cents. And the reason why I did this is because I wanted to give this kind of like dusty, kind of like deserty look to these guys, like these guys that came out of the deserts of Araby, or Kimri as it's known as in the Warhammer universe. And so because I wanted kind of like this dusty effect, at the same time it also catches this wonderful 3-dimensional look with patching that pale gray on the raised surfaces of the clothing. It also kind of dulls down and makes the undead flesh look a bit paler, and it just looks absolutely awesome when you get done with it. Now for the next set of miniatures, I decided to paint up the skeletons next, as well as the 2 whites that we have. And just like with our zombies, I decided to use burnt umber by Apple Barrel Paint. I did 2 thin layers on all the boots, the trousers, as well as the leather cuffs of their arm sleeves as well. So any clothing that they're wearing, I picked on 2 thin layers of burnt umber just because it contrasts nicely with the khaki of the skeletons. And then once we got done with the boots as well as the arm greaves as well as the pants that these guys carry, the next thing I did, of course, is I picked out their leather goods. In this case, I put 2 thin layers of pavement by Apple Barrel Paint. Pavement's a nice dark gray color, almost black. It also has a beautiful texturing on it. And it's a nice color to use in order to do a lot of dry brushing with, because of that little texture that they have as well. And so once you're done with those belts, the next thing we do now is do another base coat, this time differentiating the different sculpts. Now, as you can see here, the next step I decided to do was to paint some of the fabric that's on these miniatures. I decided to divide up the team between the two zombies, 2 skeletons, as well as the white on the left-hand side, and exactly their same counterparts on the right-hand side. So as you can see in this photo, a majority of the team is actually made up of duplicate sculpts. And so to add some variety to the miniatures and to trick the mind's eye into thinking that they're seeing individual sculpts, a technique that you can use is by using alternating color schemes. So in this case, as you can see, a lot of these guys are wearing tabards, also wearing sashes as well as collars around their necks for both sides. So we decided to paint one half of the team in blue, bright blue by Apple Barrel Paint, runs at 50 cents at your local Walmart, and the other half done in Anita's acrylic, which runs you about about 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby as well. This is Anita's Acrylic True Red, which is a very beautiful acrylic red. It's actually the best red color I've used for miniatures painting, and I absolutely love this stuff. Cannot speak enough good things about it. But by doing that, as you can see, it actually creates some variety between the blue and the red that you see in the sculpts, and it kind of tricks the viewer into thinking there's multiple sculpts on the table and a lot more diversity than there actually is. At the same time, it can also be kind of confusing to differentiate your different team members because of these duplicate sculpts. In my gaming group, I realized that if we use these red and blue to kind of do that for half the team, it makes it a little bit easier to identify the players as we're playing our games of Blood Bowl. And so you just put 2 thin layers of those colors on, you're ready to move on. So the next we're doing now is moving on to the ghouls as well as from the mummies. And as you see in this picture, we basically did the same thing by painting up the leather goods and the miniatures as well. For the trousers and the boots, as well as the trousers and the mummies, we picked those out 2 thin layers of burnt umber. It's a nice, beautiful dark brown color. The next thing we also did, of course, we picked out their belts and 2 thin layers of pavement for both the ghouls as well as for the mummies. And the last thing we did, of course, we picked out the fang accents on these miniatures as well. The ghouls have these beautiful bones that are kind of piercing their skin as well as forming tusks on their helmets. And the skeletons have like these kind of like bone necklaces with these bone charms around their necks as well. So because we picked out those details in 2 thin layers of taupe gray by Anita's Acrylic, and then from there we're ready to move on to our next base coat. And just like we did for the zombies as well as the skeletons and the whites, we also use Anita's Acrylic True Red as well as Bright Blue by Albemarle Paint to create some diversity. In this case, we're painting the tabards of both the ghouls as well as the mummies in alternating colors, so that way you can add a little bit of diversity within the sculpts that they have going on. As you can see, it does a really good job with that. So now that we're done with that step, the next thing we do now is a dry brush. So just like we did with the zombies earlier, we're going to do an all over dry brush with Pale Gray by Folk Art for the skeletons, the weights, as well as the mummies, as well as the ghouls. And what this is going to do is going to kind of give like this kind of dusty, kind of ashy, little vibrancy going on for all the miniatures in the team. As like I said before, in the world of Warhammer Fantasy, the Undead Team primarily comes from the desert wastes of Araby, also known as Kimmery in the ancient past of the Warhammer Universe's world. So because I want to create this kind of dusty effect for all of them, so I just did an all over dry brush of the Pale Gray. Alright, so now that we're done with all the details, the next thing we need to do now is work on the most prominent part of the miniature, which is the black armor. In this case, as you can see here, I picked out all the black armor in 2 thin layers of pavement by Albemarle Paint. And like I said before, this Albemarle Paint is actually not a true black, it's actually a very, very, very dark gray. But the nice thing about the pavement paint is that the pavement paint has a little bit of a grit to it, kind of like a little bit of a texturing to it. So it does a really good job when you do dry brushing and really helps to accentuate that look on anything that you paint in pavement. That's one of the reasons why I love using this color so much. So after you guys are done picking all the black armor for the helmets, the shoulder pads, the arm greaves, the leg greaves, the thigh greaves in some cases, once you're done picking out those 2 thin layers, the next thing we do now is concentrate on a couple of dry brushes. So the very first dry brush we do an all over pretty heavy dry brush of Skyline by Folk Art. You can get this stuff at your local Hobby Lobby for about 75 cents. It's a beautiful bluish gray color, and as you can see, it kind of gives the black armor these guys are wearing this kind of darkened blue kind of hinge hue to the armor. And the reason why I did that is because if you look at the box art for the Champions of Death, they kind of got this like gloomy kind of blue edge highlighting going on in the armor. Now, edge highlighting is very frustrating to apply. In my opinion, I like to use dry brushing because it's a much easier way to do it. And by using the sky blind, it could actually help kind of create that same illusion on the box art. So the next dry brush we do, now that we got the skyline on there, is to do another dry brush using Slate Blue by Anita's Acrylic. This stuff will cost you 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. All you do very quick is just a quick dry brushing all over the pavement, as well as the skyline beneath it, and what that does, it kind of accentuate a little bit of the blue hue that's on those armor, which makes it look really, really awesome. And finally, the last bit that we do for the armor is do an all over dry brush real quick with Pale Gray. We do a very, very, very light dry brush with this stuff, so that way it doesn't really overpower the blue dry brushing that we did earlier. As you can see, the armor of these guys still very much have like that bluish kind of gray look to it. At the same time, you can also got that kind of that dusty look like these guys just came straight out of the deserts. And now that we're done working on the armor, the next thing we gotta do now is do the accent pieces by highlighting and actually painting up the flame motif that's on the edge of the armor. Alright, so the next thing we're going to do now is start to rim the edge of the armor with this beautiful flaming design that the Champions of Death have on their armor painting. Now, if you guys remember from my previous video that we talked about the Wolfenburg Crypt Stealers, one of the things I'm really not good at is doing freehanding. I've always struggled doing freehanding designs on any kind of miniatures whatsoever. So because I avoid freehanding as much as possible when it comes to painting these guys. However, when it comes to the 2 undead teams for Blood Bowl, there's a lot of freehand involved in both teams, and for good reason, because those freehand designs actually really adds to the overall paint job and overall look of those teams. So because of that, I did practice freehanding with my Wolfenburg Crypt Stealers, and it actually worked out really well. I got really confident freehanding, so I decided, you know what, instead of trying to avoid it this time, I'm just going to straight do it and try to do the flame design on the black armor of the Champions of Death. Now to get that look, what you're going to have to do is basically use two colors. You're going to just use blue red as well as yellow. So the first color I use is Anita's acrylic true red. Put 2 layers of this stuff all over the rims of the base of the armor. Now the best way I found to do this is basically just to start from the edge of the armor, from the bottom of the edge of it, and then work your way up real quick and just kind of do a single brush stroke up and do it at undulating patterns. So you're basically having points of high rise and low rises, make it look really wavy and really dramatic on the armor. And the way I got around it is that because I'm freehanding this, instead of making it really small like it shows in the box art, I decided to make it a little bit more prominent, so that way I can make the flames look really big and it'd be easier to paint that design on the miniatures. So if you guys look closely here on the rim of all the shoulder pieces, the wrist guards, the arm greaves, the leg greaves of all the miniatures, I just picked those out in 2 thin layers of Anita's acrylic on that one. At the same time, a lot of these football players, especially the skeletons, the weights, as well as the mummy, they actually were wearing helmets with these red stripes running down the middle of the helmet. I picked those out in 2 thin layers of Anita's acrylic true red as well. So now that we're done with the red, the next thing we need to do now is add the yellow for the flames. In this case, I use King's Gold by Apple Burrows paint. It's the same yellow I've been using this entire time. I put 2 thin layers of this stuff all over the rim of the bases. As you can see on the armor, especially showing from the behind, so that way you guys can see what the back looks like, where it shows it the most. I just pretty much just kind of semi followed the same pattern I put down in red with the yellow, and actually just left a little red edge of red where the yellow is to make it look like it's actual fire. So it looks like it's actually coals burning on their uniforms and stuff. Now granted, it's a little bit too blocky in some areas, and it's also like maybe not as detail looking in the flames, the looking flames that I would normally like to see on my work. But at the same time though, this is the very second time I'm doing freehanding for the most part, and I'm really liking the way that it's coming out. Actually, it's actually looking really nice. The flames are quite prominent on the armor, which is kind of adds to the overall color scheme of the miniatures, and it's not looking that bad. You could of course neaten up by using different color of black and gray in order to make the flames more pronounced if you would like, but like I said, I'm not an expert heavy metal painter, and by the way, it's not that bad looking either on the tabletop. Alright, so the very last step we're going to do, of course, is a base coat for the wings of the helmets of the whites in the team as well. So I just want to add a little bit of different, more color to this to kind of make it look more vibrant with these guys. So what I decided to do is pick those in 2 thin layers of Americana Deco Art Magenta. It's a nice dark magenta color. The wings pair nicely with the black, so it looks really awesome as well. You can get this stuff at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. So now that we're done with all the base coating and the dry brushing, next thing we need to do now is work on the metallics. So when it comes to metallic elements on this team, there's not really many metallic elements, so I just basically use 2 colors. I use gunmetal gray as well as pure gold. You can get these 2 products at your local Hobby Lobby for about 75 cents. And all I did is basically picked up the metallic pieces. I just picked out the metallic pieces that I want to be done silver. I picked those out in gunmetal gray, so things like the blades, the nails, as well as rivets of the armor, stuff like that. And then of course some of the finer details, like kind of like the skull iconography that they have on the miniatures, I picked those out in 2 thin layers of pure gold by Folk Art. Now once you're done doing that, also did the rings of the hands of the little turn markers as well. So now that you're done painting those metallic elements, the next thing you do now is an all over oil wash. So like I mentioned earlier, this is a quick paint method, so we will be doing an oil wash to do all the washing for the miniatures. In this case, I would suggest using Minwax Poly Shades by Minwax. It's using the Mission Oak color. It costs you about $7 at your local Walmart. And the reason why I'd recommend using this stuff is because it does exactly the same thing as Army Painter Strong Tone, except that it's a lot cheaper. Army Painter Strong Tone costs about $32 per can, while this stuff only costs $7. So because of that, all I did is I just took my Poly Shade acrylic, mixed with a little bit of paint thinner to the darkness and brightness that I want for my wash, and I just take that wash and put it all over the entirety of the miniature. Now as you can see in this picture, the oil wash actually seeps down into the recesses of the miniature, bringing out a lot of the details that we didn't see before. At the same time, it also mutes down the vibrancy of the colors by giving the colors a darker hue, giving it a darker value. At the same time, it also smooths out the transitions between our dry brushes as well as our base coating. It kind of basically makes it blend together, and as you can see there, it makes it kind of a really nice smooth finish on these guys. And at the same time, the the oil washing also brings out a lot of the details in the miniature. Now, when you get done putting the oil wash on the miniature, I suggest you let it sit by itself and let it dry and cure for about 24 hours. And the reason why is because the polyshade is a combination of stain as well as a polyurethane. So when it does finally dry, you're gonna have like this nice candy coated high sheen gloss over the miniature that will also protect the paint job of your miniature as well. Now, if you don't care for that high sheen gloss like I do, you can of course do a spray varnish to flatten that down and make it into a matte finish. But if you like that candy coated shine, you of course could skip this next step. But now let's move on to the spray varnish and for the last bit of detail work. So the first thing I did, of course, I spray painted all the miniatures with a matte varnish. It's made by Krylon Matte Spray. I just put it all over my miniatures. It costs $5.99 at my local Walmart, and it mutes down the sheen on the miniatures. Now, next thing we do, of course, is work on all the blood and gore elements on these miniatures as well. There's actually not very many of them. Pretty much you have the 2 turn markers with their hands, as well as the 4 zombies you get in this team. Now, you could use Blood for the Blood God, which is a technical paint made by Games Workshop, which costs $7.99. It does a wonderful job, but if you're like me, you don't really want to have to rely on one pot of technical paint that can go bad really quickly. So because of that, I like to make my own blood effect. What I do is I take Anita's True Red. Like I said, it's a beautiful, wonderful red paint. It just does everything you can think of it. I take that stuff and I take Minwax water-based polyacrylic, which is a protective finish that they make. Also costs $7.99. And I get the gloss, clear gloss look as well. What I do is I do a 50-50 mix by adding 50 half parts, 2 parts, whatever parts I'm going to use of equal parts red paint and equal parts polyacrylic. Mixed together creates this high sheen, high gloss, gory effect that I put on all the wounds of the hand as well as the entrails of the zombies as well. It has a beautiful, glossy, slimy, bloody effect. It just looks absolutely fantastic when it's all said and done. So once you're done with that technical work with the miniatures, the next thing you do now is work on the bases. So the first thing I do with these bases, of course, I want to kind of give it like this kind of like this off blue gray kind of base look on the miniatures and make it match up with the Champions of Death pitch that's available by Games Workshop. So what I decided to do is to paint all the bases in Skyline by Folk Art. I'm kind of going with this kind of like this Warcry look that I did the Warcry ruins that I have on my channel as well. So I just did a single coat of blue Skyline all over the entire base of the miniature. And if a little bit of the right undercoat kind of pokes through, it's not a big deal. And the reason why is because when we get to the dry brushing phase, it's just going to help accentuate it. So the next thing, of course, I did a heavy dry brush with with Folk Art's Pale Gray. As you see, I just did a real quick dry brush all over the entirety of the miniature of the bases. As you can see there, if we had any white undercoat that I was showing through earlier, it doesn't really matter because it just looks like it's part of the pale gray dry brushing that we did in the miniature. As you can see, it kind of creates this kind of ashy, dusty look on the bases with the darker skyline kept in the recesses. So the next thing we do real quick is we give these bases a wash. In this case, what I do is I use Burnt Umber by Apple Barrel Paint. I just take Burnt Umber, I put it inside of a palette, I mix it and water it down with some water until it's about the consistency of milk. And then what I do is I take that watery Burnt Umber look, I just wash it all over the miniature. And basically that dark Burnt Umber kind of blends the 2 layers of the Anita's Gray, sorry, not the Anita's Gray, the Folk Art Pale Gray and the Folk Art Skyline. It just kind of makes it look like this kind of dusty, dirty, soily kind of look going on, kind of grimy as well, which makes it look really, really awesome. And then once this stuff dries, the next we do now is a flocking. So in this photo, as you can see, I just do a quick flock on the bases. I put some wood glue on the bases and I dust it with our studio's homemade flock. My buddy Iron Major, who's our resident terrain wizard, actually has a whole bunch of homemade flock that he primarily makes out of sawdust. He takes sawdust, he dyes it with different color cheap acrylic paints, lets it dry, and crumbles it up again. And as you can see in this photo, I put that homemade flock on their bases to kind of create this kind of grassy, dusty, dirty kind of base that looks like it's tore up soil on a Blood Bowl pitch. And finally, the last thing we do, of course, is we rim the bases in 3 layers of palm leaf. You can get this stuff at your local Walmart for 50 cents. And the reason why I put 3 layers on is because some of the darker skyline did kind of seep down along the edges, and I want to make sure I fully hid that dark color beneath the palm leaf. So I just put 3 really quick layers on this one, and we're completely done. As you can see, it's a nice vibrant green color that goes nicely with the flocking that I put on the bases. At the same time, it's also kind of nostalgic because it kind of reminds me of the classic bright green base look that used to have for all their miniatures from the mid-90s, and just also adds to the overall cartoony look of the Blow Up miniatures as well. And once it's dry, here you go, and this is what the end result will look like for your Champions of Death Blood Bowl team, and this is what the end result will look like as well by using the Cheapskate quick paint method that we use on our miniatures. So now that we're done showing you guys how we went about painting these guys up, next what we're going to do now is run down a shopping list of different products you need to buy from Army Painter as well as Citadel in order to paint these miniatures exactly the same we did and show you the savings involved. So, up next is the Citadel and Army Painter method. These are the materials you need to buy from both these companies in order to paint your miniatures the same way we did, using their same materials. Now, the first thing you'll need, of course, is spray these guys in Corax White Spray for the primer. That will cost you $17. And then for the flesh and bones, you'll need to paint the zombies in Gauss Blaster Green, one of your ghouls in Screamer Pink, one of your other ghouls in Gene Stealer Purple, and then, of course, your guys' mummies in Baylor Brown and Morghast Bone. All those colors run you $4.55 for those. Now, once you get done with that, of course, you will have to dry brush these miniatures. You'll need to dry brush them in Morghast Bone, Cyberite Green, Fulgrim Pink, Takala Lilac, as well as Wraithbone. All those will cost you $4.55 for those colors as well. Now, for all the black leather goods as well as for the armor, you'll need to use Eshin Gray, which runs you $4.55 for that color. And for all the pants and trousers and leather goods, you'll need to use XV88, which costs you $4.55. Wildwood, which costs you $7.80. Rakarth Flesh would also cost you $4.55 for that. Now, for the hairs of the zombies, you'll need to use Troll Slayer Orange and Everland Sunset, which runs you $4.55 for those. And then for the skeletal structure of the zombies are peeking through, you'll need to use Bane Blade Brown. That costs you $4.55 for that as well. Now, for the other parts of the miniature as well, you need to dust them all and with a all-over dry brush of Ulthuan Gray, which is $4.55 for that color as well. Now, for all the red that you're doing on these miniatures, for like the tabards as well as the flames on the armor, and you'll need to use Mephiston Red, which costs you $4.55 for that color. And for all the parts you're doing in blue for the tabards, you need to buy Techless Blue, which costs you $4.55 for that. Now, to do the dry brushing on the armor, you'll need to use Rust Gray, which runs you $4.55 for that color. And also at the same time, you'll also need to use Pink Core, which runs you $4.55 for the little wing icons that we did on the whites that we have for our team as well. Now, for all the parts that you did for the armor, for the metallics, you'll need to use Lead Belcher for the silver, as well as Retribute Armor for the gold, runs just $7.80 for those. And then because you're using a quick paint method, you'll need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone, runs you $32 for that product to wash over the miniatures. Now, if you decide to do a matte finish for your miniatures, you need to buy a can of Munitorium Varnish, runs you $19.50 for that. And then for the blood effect that we put for our zombies, you need to buy a pot of blood for the Blood God, which runs you $4.55 for that color as well. Next thing you do, of course, start working on the bases, and the thing to do that, you need to do start dusting a flock from Army Painter Basing Set, runs you $18.99 for that product. And then lastly, you run the bases in 3 layers of Militarum Green, which runs you $4.55 for that. Now, assuming that you're buying everything on this list from Army Painter as well as Citadel for the very first time, you're talking about a grand total investment of $215.54 to paint up these miniatures exactly the same we did using Citadel and Army Painter. And once again, that's assuming that you're purchasing these all for the very first time. Now, when you compare it to the Cheapskate method, and once again, we're assuming that you're purchasing everything for the very first time with our Cheapskate method, you're talking about a grand total of that being $38.21 for the Cheapskate method. So when you take the two values and subtract the two, you end up with a grand total savings of $177.33 to paint your miniatures using the Cheapskate method on your guys' Champions of Death team for Blood Bowl. So there you guys have it. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest greatest hobby news related to our channel. That's good to do for this. You guys. I'll catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.